Yeah, I think one of the ideas that Atlantis challenges is that we're always technologically progressing. There's this idea that progress has been this like one unbroken line from caveman to now. And I think in reality it's more of a like a sawtooth. It's up and down. And one of the things that really astonished me and when I went to Egypt was that the older sites were bigger, they had bigger stones that were more precise, better carved, better built, more symmetry, just more precision. And the newer stuff seemed to like crudely mimic the older stuff. I wanted to get your thoughts on the ebb and flow, the rise and fall of technology throughout civilization. Like, does it always progress linearly, or do we see times where it really peaks and then there's a big drop off?
Yeah, technology is a really interesting question because that's what we tend to focus on today. People often focus on technology when they're evaluating civilizations. And we tend to have, I feel, an unreasonable adoration of a higher technology. So if some civilization has high tech, we think, ooh, they're great, they're wonderful. Or, they're more advanced or more sophisticated or something than another. And I'm not as infatuated with technology. I mean, it's a tool, and high tech isn't always the best tech either. Sometimes a simpler technology actually is better. I mean, the example today is, everybody wants me to connect everything to Bluetooth. My washing machine has to go through Bluetooth. My printer on my computer should run through my phone. I don't want that. That just makes it vulnerable and fragile. I would rather have just a crude washing machine that I poke. It works manually and doesn't, die when the power goes out or something. So I'm not convinced that high tech is good. And this is I mean, I like technology. I'm an advocate of it, but we're unquestioning about how we always think this. And I'll give you my ancient history example. Um, what first led me to think about technology and sort of where high tech is better is when I was studying in grad school olive presses. So these are, in the ancient world, olives were one of the big foods, one of the main foods that people ate, usually in the form of olive oil. So to make olive oil, you take a bunch of olives, you put them in these sort of woven baskets, you put them in some kind of press, you squash out the juice, you collect the juice. Well, there were different kinds of olive presses in the ancient world. There was one called a lever press, which is basically a big tree trunk with some rock weights on it, which press the baskets. And there's a screw press, where you carve a large tree trunk into the shape of a screw, and then you get a thing with grooves that you carve in it, and you turn it, and you can tighten it and press the olive. And in a lot of the literature I was reading, everybody talked about how, oh, the screw press is better, it's superior. This means that this site of olive production was more efficient and more advanced than this other one that used a lever press. One of my professors kind of talked to me about this and was saying, well, all that means is that the lever press or the screw press is really, really expensive to make. It's difficult to make, so you got to get that carving just right. If it's a tiny bit off, then it breaks and shatters and it's useless. And it's fragile. Whereas the lever press will always work. You pile up some rocks, you squash your olives, you get your juice. So low tech is really appropriate tech. And in some ways, it's superior. It's more flexible. It's more versatile. It's easier to build. It's easier to maintain. It's cheaper. But we're so conditioned today to see high technology is better that when the first scholars studied all these things, they just unquestionably said, this is better. This is superior, even though demonstrably it isn't. So, and the other thing about technology when it comes to ancient history that I run across all the time is sort of the assumption, sometimes it's even an unconscious one, that because we have a higher level of technology, we're smarter than someone else. And that absolutely isn't the case. I mean, the people in the ancient world were fully as intelligent as we are. They had a much lower level of technology, a more primitive, if you like, level of technology, but they weren't any stupider. They were every bit as smart. And in fact, in many ways, I think they were more creative because you couldn't lean on technology as a crutch. You had to solve things for yourself. And this is a long-winded answer to get back to what you're asking. When it comes to building stuff in the ancient world, you can achieve an awful lot if you have something that they had a lot of in the ancient world, which we don't seem to have today, which is patience and manpower. So if you're just patient and your building time is 5, 10, 20, 100 years, you can build some absolutely unbelievable structures with incredibly crude tools. So you just have guys with wooden mallets chipping away at marble blocks, and you have thousands of people hauling these blocks, and you can fit them together unbelievably well, and you can build these enormous structures that last for thousands of years. But it takes patience, intensive manpower, and having a building time frame that's measured in years, not days. And I look around today, and if anything takes more than a couple months to build, we think there's an issue. Well, in the Middle Ages, they would build cathedrals that took 600 years, that are 500. The Cologne Cathedral has a twin tower facade that's 515 feet high. It's unbelievable. And they built it in an era where all they were doing was piling up rocks. And it's the most amazing building you can imagine. It's better than anything we build today. It's more impressive. It's bigger. It'll last longer. And it's made with incredibly simple technology that you're just willing to invest enormous amounts of time and manpower in. So when this comes to the ancient world, people are always like, oh, the mystery. How did they build the pyramids? It's so mysterious. It's kind of not. If you're patient and you apply the technologies we know they had, and your time frame is 5, 10, 15, 20, 100 years, you build these amazing structures, and you don't need high technology to do it. But we just can't get into that mentality. Earlier, I was talking about different mentalities. We can't envision what they did in the Middle Ages, where people would say, I'm going to start building a cathedral for my city, and I'm going to die before we finish the foundations of that cathedral. And my grandsons are only going to see maybe a couple stories of it. But I don't care. I'm going to devote my life and all the spare resources of my entire city to building this thing that won't be finished for 8 generations. Now, is there any project today that people would say, we're going to take all our time, money, and effort and dump it into something that we won't see a payoff for 300 years? No. And that's a different mentality. But in the Middle Ages, Christianity was quite dominant. It dominated people's lives. It was important to them. They said, I want to devote the next 300 labor and effort to this project for my cathedral because my faith is important to me, and I'm going to do that. And we can't even get into that mindset. We don't have the patience to wait 5 minutes for something today, let alone 300 years. So a lot of it is, like I said, mentality and understanding these people are operating under a different system. And if you change those parameters of what you think is tolerable or acceptable, yeah, you can do amazing things. But you're doing them under a different set of operating parameters than modern 21st century human beings would find acceptable. I mean, if you were trying to sell that today in the United States, hey, we're going to start this project, we won't finish for 300 years, nobody would buy into that. But they did it all the time, over and over and over again throughout history. And that's where you get some of these amazing things.
That was an amazing point, and I think you just really touched on it. Something that we're missing in our society now is that mindset, because everything we're surrounded by is so like temporary, and it's all about quick and efficient and productivity.
Yep.
And it really puts you in this frame of mind that you're kind of temporary and you're supposed to be productive, and that's your worth. And when I do visit these ancient sites like a cathedral or ancient Egypt, it's hard to wrap your mind around just how much time these things took to build. Like, you look at one wall and it took multiple generations to etch whatever's on that wall into the wall. And I think because it's so beautiful or precise, we think, oh, they had some sort of high technology to do that, because we think, oh, this, I wouldn't spend more than 10 minutes on this wall. But if somebody spent their entire life on that wall, they could do it with a toothpick, maybe. And I've had this debate because when I went to Egypt, there was a really interesting site that had these tube drill holes. I don't know if you've ever heard of these. They were kind of controversial because they look like you took a very high-powered drill and drilled into the rock. And it's very hard for me to wrap my mind around. I'm like, this looks like high technology. But then somebody said, no, no, look at this YouTube video. And these guys with very primitive tools, they put some like quartz and water and a copper and they rotated it around.
Mm-hmm.
And in about
Mm-hmm.
45 minutes, they were able to get down about maybe about a centimeter. Not much. But if you did that for weeks, you'd have a pretty deep hole. And so I thought, oh wow, that's a pretty primitive tool there.
Yeah, and I mean that's why I like talking. That's why I like talking about the Middle Ages and cathedrals specifically, because in the ancient world, there's all these things that were built and we don't know built. So, in ancient Egypt, there's all kinds of stuff like how did they do this? We don't know exactly. That's not to say we can't envision 3 or 4 different ways they might have, but we don't actually know which one they did use, right? And that opens that door to speculation. Well, this is just so labor intensive. They can't have done this. It must have gotten help from somewhere, or lost technology or whatever. But in the Middle Ages, they had the same technology more or less as they had in antiquity, but we've got the records. We know exactly what method they used and what they did to build those cathedrals. And there the answer is unbelievable amounts of time and elbow grease. So it's human beings chipping away at rocks for 600 years. And they build these incredible structures, and we've got all the documentation, we have the blueprints, we have the building accounts, we have the records of the financial, how much they paid the workers for how long. So we know exactly what they did, and they built things that are just mind-boggling. I mean, I once spent a summer traveling around Europe just going to cathedrals because these things are just so amazing. And they're better than anything we're building today. They're incredible, but they were built with guys with incredibly primitive technology. So, they could have done that in the ancient world as well. And in fact, I suspect that's exactly what they did. But we don't have that same level of documentation for that era that we do for the Middle Ages, but it's the same kind of stuff. But that's, again, that mentality that just seems so foreign to us. I just can't imagine doing that, instant gratification. I need to see a result now. So we know a way they could have done something, but we'll dismiss it because it seems like, well, who's going to, scrape at that little hole with some sand for 8 months to make a single drill hole? Nobody. Well, no, that's the kind of thing they did all the time. And we know about it because they did in the Middle Ages all the time.
Yeah, good point. But is there anything that does blow you away that says, wait, this is a complete anomaly? Like, we don't know what they used to build this. Is there anything that stands out to you?
I don't know. I mean, most of it is, like I said, you can envision how something was built. I mean, to me, it's more the daring of some of these people, how they would build things, because they didn't have computer modeling and they didn't have our modern understanding of stress or material science, knowing like, okay, what is the fracture point of this rock? How much weight can I put on this column? How much weight can I support on this roof? But they were willing to dream big and experiment. So, the Romans make a concrete vault that's 150 feet wide and say, well, let's just try it and see if it stands. And it does. And it's still here 2,000 years later. But that's a very different thing to do when you don't have our modern understanding of material science to know that it's going to work. And again, back to cathedrals, you see that with the building of cathedrals. So you can trace how every cathedral that was built would attempt to push up the height of the nave, the central space, a little bit more, and they would attempt to give over a little bit more of the walls to windows. So it was this famous competition for height and light. So every town that would build a cathedral would make their cathedral's nave a little higher and make their windows a little bigger, make the walls a little smaller. And they were incremental because nobody could do the precise calculations to know, well, what is the point at which we reach where the rock can no longer support the weight of the roof and it'll collapse? Or how much wall can we get rid of without knowing where the thing will collapse? And what's great is you can see the end point of that because they kept building these higher, more light, until the town of Beauvais in France built one where they pushed the nave, I think it's up to 160 feet. Like Notre Dame in Paris is only 108 feet tall. This is 160 feet. And a couple of years after finishing it, it all collapsed because they had literally pushed the stone beyond the point it could bear. So this is trial and error. You're doing a trial and error experiment. We'll make it bigger. If it stands, the next one will make a little bit bigger. If it stands, the next one will make a little bit bigger. And finally, they hit the one that, nope, it collapsed. And after that, they couldn't go any higher. No one built a higher nave because they knew they'd reached the limit of stone, what stone was capable of. And you don't get higher internal spaces until you have steel girder supports. So technology comes to the rescue. But it's a perfect example to they did things in antiquity, that you just keep pushing those boundaries a little bit. You see what happens until something goes wrong. And that's doing stuff without all the understanding of science and technology. It's just trial and error. It's like a little kid piling up blocks until they fall down and seeing how far you can go. And you can build some pretty amazing stuff with that technique.
Hmm. Yeah, you made me think of warfare as it pertains to technology. Like I think this mindset, this modern mindset we have, it also involves warfare because whoever has the best technology today usually wins the war. But before it was like about the numbers you had or the your psychology, like how fierce you were, and um yeah, I mean not long ago, only maybe about a couple hundred years ago, they were fighting just like the Romans were thousands of years ago. Is that is that accurate to think about, like for a long time that warfare didn't really change much, and then all of a sudden, we have modern warfare, World War One, World War Two. It's a new thing.
Yeah, I mean, technology and warfare is an interesting case study because first of all, almost all new technologies, their first practical application is in warfare. So it's sort of sad, but when we invent something, we often invent it so we can kill other humans. Or when there is warfare, it serves as a spur to technological innovation. So, you look at World War II, and we have, all kinds of things being developed. Penicillin, and airplanes go from little biplanes with, sort of cloth and fabric to jets within 4 or 5 years. So warfare really does spur technological innovation, and military equipment tends to reflect the highest level of technology of any civilization at any given moment. And that tends to hold true throughout a lot of history, because there is an obvious advantage. If you have a technologically superior tool, you can often kill your fellow human being than someone who doesn't. And yeah, there have been a number of big technological revolutions. So, I mean, initially you have the era of sort of edged weapons, which lasted for quite a while. You have technological innovations in missile weapons, going from different types of bows and arrows, slings, javelins, stuff like that, crossbows. Then you have the gunpowder revolution, which changed everything very dramatically. And you have, new things like airplanes and tanks and submarines, and each one of them completely and usually instantly causes everything before it to become outdated. So there are multiple times these moments where something new enters warfare, and in an amazingly short period of time, disadvantage against this higher level of technology. Now, on the other hand, the other two things that tend to help you win in war are discipline, organization, and experience. So troops who have fought before will do better than ones who haven't. Troops who are highly disciplined will do better than ones who aren't. Armies that are highly organized, not just in fighting, but logistics, everything else, would do better than ones that aren't. So those are ways to sometimes overcome technology. But yeah, I mean, the history of warfare is the history of technological change, I would say. That's certainly a way that you can frame all of human warfare is a story of technological innovation and change, with these other factors, being the things that can shift a little bit or a little bit less advantages if you do them very well.